Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kentlands lecture series. This is a joint lecture series of the Kentlands Community Foundation and Gaithersburg Planning. I am John Schlichting. I'm the Director of Planning and Code Administration for the city. Rosalie Wyke would be here introducing Dhiru. However, she is in Puerto Rico. Rosalie is the outgoing, or I guess the last chair of the Kentlands Community Foundation. I am also a former chair of the Kentlands Community Foundation. We are very pleased this evening to have from the city of Gaithersburg, Councilmember Neil Harris. And we have from our Planning Commission, Lloyd Kaufman. And I'm very pleased to see my historic planner, Chris Berger, also a Lakelands resident. So this lecture series is Rosalie's sort of passion, and she was sorry to miss it. But we are very delighted this evening to have Dhiru Thadani. Dhiru is an architect and urbanist who has been in practice since 1980. And has worked internationally. He has been principal designer of new towns and cities, urban regeneration, neighborhood revitalization, and infill densification. Dhiru was born in Bombay, India, and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1972 to study architecture. During his 45 years in Washington, D.C., he has taught, practiced, and has strived to place architecture and urbanism in the public eye. Since its formation in 1993, Dhiru has been charter member of the Congress for New Urbanism, CNU, and served as task force chair and board member from 1997 to 2013. In 2015, he was appointed to the inaugural CNU College of Fellows and received the International Society of City and Regional Planners Lifetime Achievement Award. He is the recipient of the 2011 Seaside Prize, an award given for significant contributions to the quality and character of communities. In 2001, he was a Knight Foundation Community Builder Fellow. He is recipient of 6 CNU Charter Awards. Dhiru was part of the original charrette team for Kentlands held in June 1988. That's so exciting. And a follow-up charrette in 2003. He is the author of The Language of Towns and Cities, a visual dictionary published by Rizzoli in 2010, and co-editor of Leon Creer, The Architecture of Community, published by Island Press in 2009. Thadani authored Visions of Seaside, Foundations, Evolution, Imagination, Built and Unbuilt Architecture, which was published by Rizzoli in September 2013. With that, here's Dhiru.
Great, well, thank you. Thank you. So is this on? Can you all hear me? Is this mic on? The mic that I'm wearing? Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. And this is my favorite subject. I love to talk about cities and urbanism. So I'm really happy to be here and return to Kentlands, where I worked 30 years ago. So in the same building, just on the other side of this room. We had a studio set up, and there was a lot of us. And Joel Fondre was the developer who started the project. And we all traveled to London with Joe and England and traveled around looking at projects and looking at developments. So it was really a fun project. And unfortunately, he couldn't hold on to it. So this talk today, all my talks are sort of different. There's different pieces. I tried till the very last minute trying to take not make it too personal about Kentlands, but there's a lot of that in here. But it's really about a journey that I started 35 years ago, really to kind of discover urbanism and really the art of urbanism. So you can write all the codes, you can write all the form-based codes, traditional codes, you can do all that, but it still doesn't guarantee good places. There is something else that is needed to really make great places. And it just cannot be codified. No matter how hard you try, you can get to a level of competence, but in most cases, in a lot of cases where I work, the architects are just not trained to really understand urbanism, and they'll fight the codes and still produce mediocrity. So I grew up in this really wonderful city of Bombay, and my entire initial upbringing, my father made some really good choices about where we stayed, and I really feel now that it's having stayed in these really beautiful places, always facing either the water or large central space, really influenced my thinking. I also, in a house I can move around, right there, this was the university, and when I lay in bed it was an apartment, and I looked across through the window, I would see the word science, which was written on the entablature of the university. And sure enough, I wanted to be a scientist. It was just kind of brainwashed in my head. And my first major was nuclear physics and chemical engineering. So places where you live and things that you see as a child really affect what profession or what your passions will be. So I left Bombay, which was at the time considered the Paris of Asia. It was a beautiful city, 4.5 million people, and I could walk, at the age of 7, I could walk from my apartment to the Regal Cinema, which was right here. All the major movie studios from Hollywood had built large Art Deco palace theaters in Bombay. So there was the Metro, which was built by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the Regal, which was 20th Century Fox, the Strand, the Excelsior, and all these large theaters would have movies on Sundays for kids, like from 10 o'clock till 1 o'clock. And I could walk at the age of 7, leave my home, get to this intersection, know that I couldn't cross the intersection, and someone, a complete stranger, would take my hand and walk me across the street, to get to the Regal. Just a complete stranger. It could have been a hawker who was at the side of the road. It could be a beggar who was at whose corner it was, but someone would see me trying to cross the street and would just come along, hold my hand, and take me across the street. And I'd get to the movie theater. I'd tell them I didn't really know what money was at that age, and I just tell them my address. They would note it in a book. I could go to the concession, get popcorn, note it in a book, and magically it was paid for. And I could do that. I could go to several of the theaters around my house, and that was Bombay, 4.5 million people. It was really an amazing city at the time, and a real kind of sense of community, which I continue to miss. So coming to Washington, Washington was a dump in '72. If anyone remembers, there was no transit, no metro. It was crime-ridden. I lost all my freedom that I had experienced in Bombay when I came to Washington. The sad story is that Washington as a city has improved tremendously over the last 40 years, whereas Bombay has done all the wrong decisions and has completely declined. It's a city that I don't even recognize anymore, and I feel completely alien when I'm there now. So I've been able to watch and document both these places. I had an office in Bombay for a while, and I've been able to watch both these cities and start to realize what decisions have made it for a great city and what have deteriorated the city. So just some biases. I like to draw. I try to draw every day if I can. And I love cities and I love books. I like making books, and I really buy into this idea, this notion, this description of insanity that Einstein put forth, that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And it seems like we we just don't learn. We keep making the same mistake over and over again and think we're going to get a different result. And this is uniform. I mean, I've worked in China, Russia, India, all these places. Somehow they think autocentric environments what they want to emulate, and they think they're going to have a different result from the US. So these are the books, some of the books that I've been involved in. The most important book that I would say is the book by Leon Krier, The Architecture Community, and that's the one book I would recommend to everyone because it really kind of lays down a foundation for urban design, and it's a kind of complete package of what urban design is and how cities should be. This is my last book, which was really a lot of fun, on Seaside, which is a project I worked on in 1980 with Andres and Liz, and who were also the designers at Kentlands. And it was really great going back and revisiting it 33 years later and trying to document what had happened over the last 33 years. So I had to pop this in because the young lady over there in the image is my daughter. And when I was working on the Kentlands charrette, she was 1 year, it was June 1st, and she was 1 year old. And we had to postpone her birthday because I was working on the charrette. She still thinks that, it's scarred her. She blames me that it scarred her for life, that new urbanism took precedent over her first birthday. But I think she's done okay, but so I had to show this picture. And the other interesting thing when I talk about, this was her first birthday party. There's a map of India with the American flag surrounding it. And who would have thought that, 25 years later, she would decide to make India her home. So she did exactly the opposite thing that I did. I came to the States, and she has lived full-time in India now for the last 8 years. So I'm going to talk about, compact, complete, connected. It's a theme that is very relevant to the work that we do. And when I was asked to give a title, I just put this title out without really thinking much about where I was going to be. So, but this is very relevant in terms of planning principles. So the first is that, if developments are compact, the result is the preservation and stewardship of land resources. So that's one very good reason. In most suburban areas, we are consuming more land than the population increase. If you look at the rise of population in most suburban areas and most cities, that rise of population is much lower than the consumption of land. So because we've been sprawling for so long, and we continue to build endless amounts of housing all over the place. Complete, I define as access to all your daily needs within a 10-minute walk. And I think that's what is the fundamental idea behind urbanism and neighborhoods, or good neighborhoods. And then finally, connected is exactly not that image, but is really creating an equitable relationship between pedestrian, bicyclist, transit, and private vehicles. Not what we've been doing. So this is a diagram done by Leon Krier, and for a lot of us, it was the diagram. It was the aha moment for us. So when we were working on Seaside, we sent Leon Krier the plan of Seaside for a review, and to get his feedback on the plan. And he sent back this drawing, plus his own version of what Seaside should be. Not to say that this is, it was a counter proposal, but really a critique of the initial plan of Seaside. And many of the elements that he put forth in that counter proposal actually made its way into the final plan. So I'll explain how he describes this drawing. When you go to a city for the first time, any city, anywhere in the world, and you go to the information center, you get a map. You ask for a map, and you get a map that basically, in cartoon form, identifies all the significant places in that city. This happens in almost in any city. At the train station you go, you get this map, and all and I would say mostly good European cities more than American cities, but places like Stockbridge or wonderful little towns also have that kind of map. And what you get is these little cartoons of all the significant structures. This is what that town, that culture is proudest of. They want you to go see these buildings, okay? And they say, this defines our culture. And those buildings really are the public realm. They're the civic institutions of that culture. The second drawing represents the other realm, which is the private realm. And on those maps, those tourist maps, that is drawn flat. It's not adorned. Not to say that the architecture is inferior or bad, it's just to say that that is the private realm and it's less important than the civic realm. And when you put those two things together, you get what Leo calls a true city. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that not every space gets filled when you put those two maps together. And the significant civic institutions have public spaces fronting them. And that's really, and the size of those public spaces have something to do with the importance of those institutions. So, and you can look at Washington and the Capitol and the Mall. Okay, the most important building in Washington is the Capitol, and the Mall expresses that. That's the largest space, and in fact, they extended it by a mile in 1900. They thought it wasn't big enough, so it went from 1.5 miles to 2.25 miles. When the Macmillan Commission extended the mall and made the site for the Lincoln Memorial. So this is, now you could look at this drawing on many levels. You could look at it as a neighborhood, at the scale of the neighborhood. You could look at it at the scale of the town, or you can look at it at the scale of the city. The principle is the same. You have the civic realm, you have the private realm. Okay? Together you make the true city, and you have voids within that plan that are always in front of the civic buildings, and the streets become the kind of umbilical cord that connects those public spaces. In today's world, we have lost that clarity where private institution buildings say, look at me, and they have overwhelmed the civic realm or the civic buildings. And that's something that's fundamentally wrong in what we've been doing, in the last 50 years. But the true city, in places like small towns like here, can adhere to these principles, and it gives you some clarity when you go through. These become the markers. At the level of the city, various neighborhoods get their identity from those civic institutions. So, for instance, like I'll talk about Bombay, Afghan church. Yes, it's a church, Afghan, it's a Muslim neighborhood, but it happens to have a Catholic church, and that neighborhood is called Afghan church. It's really a dichotomy when you think about it, but that's what the neighborhood gets its name from that very famous church. Or Churchgate, which is a train station, it gets its identity from the fact that there's this public building, the train station there, and so on and so forth. So at the level of the city, that's the most important. Now, one other thing that happens in this drawing, when you look at the scale of the city, is you see that all these civic institutions are scattered around the plan. They're not all grouped together to make a government district like in Washington. They're scattered around because you want to take these civic institutions and spread them around so they give different areas within the city or town their identity, and they activate different parts of the city. I could go on about this, but I'll stop at that. And these were just some of the things, when you look at it at the scale of a neighborhood, a town, or the city, each neighborhood has civic buildings and spaces. They're mixed use, they're mixed income, they're compact, they have a center and edge, a definable center, and that center is usually a civic building and civic space. There's a kind of network of public spaces connected by streets. It's pedestrian friendly. They're served by transit, and that the city in the end is a collection of these neighborhoods. The confusion that we have is today we think of urban or urbanism as density. But urbanism and cities are much more than that. It's not a metric. And I think there's confusion that we look at what a city is and we say X amount of people living per square mile or in an acre. And you think, that's dense, so it's a city. Or it's urban. That's not correct because, and this whole notion that 50% of the world's population now live in cities as of 2000 is completely a misnomer because they live in a metric that defines urbanism, but they don't really live with the qualities of a city. Okay? And if you just look at the words urbane, what those words mean, you realize there's more to the city or what urban is than just a bunch of words, this metric. So cities really, the way I learned to draw, and I wish someone had taken a picture of this when I was 5 years old, but the son of domestic help in the building that I lived in Bombay, turned out later became a very famous artist, but he was about 8 years older than me. He was 13, I was 5. He gave me my first pencil and piece of paper because from my balcony I looked down and I saw him drawing. I went down, so I talked to him and I realized I want to be able to do that. And I really learned, and he said, oh yeah, sure, you can do that. And he handed me a piece of paper and pencil. And that's sort of set me off into drawing because I saw him do that. And it's the same as this little girl watching someone paint in Paris, or this person at a museum, emulating what she sees, and maybe one day she'll become a dancer. And that's the quality of urban life. It inspires people to do things that they didn't know about or want to do. Not this. This is the metric version of urbanism. This is in China, and they're building this all over the place. These are not cities. These are just warehouses for people. This is high density with no quality of urban life. Or this version, which happens everywhere. This happens to be in Colorado, but this could be anywhere. It could be, outside here, where you see the spaghetti of roads and placelessness. Okay, the intentions were good. They wanted to house people. They wanted to give everyone a place to live, but the resultant was really no place at all. And it's a global problem. It's not just in the US. This is in China. And as the codes change, you can see the buildings get higher. It's outside New Delhi. It's outside Paris. It's the same thing. It's placelessness. It's just warehousing of people. Now, in '65, Jane Jacobs came along and wrote this really wonderful book. And I put this drawing of mine of this, it's a famous painting in France at the Louvre about man at the window. So the best way to police the public realm is to have eyes on the street. And Jane Jacobs told us that. And nothing, no amount of CCTV cameras is ever going to replace that form of security. The safest way to make a secure place is to have multiple windows, everything facing the public realm, okay? And that's real time. You hear someone make a noise, you see it, you report it. You cannot imagine how boring it is to look at a screen of 24 monitors. Who is watching that? It's great after the fact. Every time those CCTV cameras are used, it's after the crime has occurred, or days after. You go back, you rewind the tape, and you find out what happened. But it doesn't solve a damn thing. And right now, this whole notion of smart cities is really about selling technology. It's all about capital investment. It's not really solving anything at all. Now, the Chinese knew this, centuries ago when they built the Great Wall. They made these little portals so they could look through and secure their borders. So it's not a new concept of having, eyes on the street. This happened, centuries ago. So I'm going to talk about 5 crises. There are many crises, but I'm going to talk about 5 which are directly affected, or their outcomes can be affected by the way we plan our environment. The first is that in 2000, when we reached this mark where we said, the metric said that 50% of the world's population lived in urban areas, suddenly everyone took notice. okay, World Bank, United Nations. Prior to that, they were always funding projects in the hinterlands outside. They were trying to, house people way out on cheap land and impacting the poorest people with the longest times and transportation costs. But the World Bank and the UN came out with this report where they said, at that time, in 2000, 6 billion people, they said that what they found out was that 2 billion, 1/3 of the world's population in 2000, had no access to water in their homes. They had to leave their home to access water. That's 1/3 of the world's population, 2 billion people. 4 billion people, 2/3, lived in what they called insecure housing, that they had no control over the fate of their housing situation, either as renters or in slums or in some form of housing that they didn't control. They could be out of a house, out of their home, at the whim of someone else. Okay, only 2 billion people on Earth actually lived in secure housing. So what they came out with after this very heavy report, knowing that the world's population was going to increase to 9.1 billion by 2050, basically came out with this report saying that we need about 3 billion new housing units in the world. One, we got to take care of all those people who are living in substandard housing, and then two, we got to take care of all the people who are going to join us on this planet in in 50 years, between 2000. Okay, and that number is really on target because now we're at about 7.3 billion. So you can see that we're actually increasing, and the increase in America by 2050 will be almost 80 million people. So just think about where are those 80 million people going to stay in the next 32 years. I mean, if Trump has his way, maybe there won't be that increase, but that's what all the statistics are showing us going in that direction. So graphically, in 1900, only 10% of the world's population lived in cities, again, measured as a metric. 2000, it was half and half, 50%, and by 2050, it will average to be 75% of the world's population living in cities. China wants 85% of their population living in cities, in that form of housing. India thinks they'll reach about 50% of their population. But we know that cities are exploding everywhere. The second crisis is peak oil. No matter what science you believe, if this is the Earth and it's the gas tank of the Earth, we're at that 50% point. And it's going down. And no amount of magic is going to fill that gas tank up. So we're on the decline. And depending on who you believe, it looks like it's about 40 years more before we're totally out of oil. Okay, and it's getting more and more expensive to extract that oil and more dangerous. And in this kind of automobile-dependent society that we built, nobody is happy. I just drove over from Washington, and I could see all those angry faces on 270 and 495. Okay, nobody was happy about that drive. The transit users unhappy, the pedestrians unhappy. So there's no good solution if you totally base your environment on automobiles. But the bigger crime of automobiles dependency is that we've just become immune to the amount of people that we lose every year in automobile fatalities. In this country, 1 in 8,000 people die every year in automobile. That means about 37 to 38, it dropped down to 37, it's spiking up again into the 40,000 range per year. Okay, that's the equivalent, of Vietnam. Vietnam was 55,000 people. This happens every year. Okay, we should be building a monument every year to the people who die in automobile accidents. And I'm sure all of you, I know for myself, know somebody who's lost a child. And 60% of those people who die every year are between the ages of 16 and 25. 60%. And we have just become immune to this idea that that's the price we're willing to pay for an auto-dependent society. Okay, no one talks about it, but so in the period of this talk, 3 people will have died in this country, okay, and 300 people will have been injured. And automobile fatalities. Okay, so it's an incredible cost that we've just come to accept. So that's really the weapon of mass destruction. This is the Nano by my countryman Tata building this thing. It's it's a great little car, but horrible, $2,500, no seat belts, bad for your health, produces, pollutants, consumes oil, makes you sedentary, lands up in landfill, and not so good for the economy. The other issue is climate change, and no matter what you believe, Kant still believe that they're deniers, but I just read, I'm taking a class on climate change right now, and one of the things that we discussed last night was 50 years ago, in 1968, President Johnson went in front of Congress to get a bill passed to look at CO2 emissions, to reduce CO2 emissions. And that was in 1968, and Congress funded it. In 1988, 20 years later, there was there was no doubt that we were actually affecting, that man was affecting the CO2 emissions and the climate. So what have we been doing for the last 30 years is pretty incredible that we haven't really addressed this issue. And we get things like this, 36 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. This happened 4 years ago in Bombay. We normally get 72 inches in 3 months. We got half that in one single day. The other issue that's come to the forefront is public health and how we've all become fatter. We've all gained weight. We don't do enough exercise, excepting for John, who clocks in 30,000 miles on some days, 30,000 steps rather, which is pretty phenomenal. But everything about the way we are living our lives is unhealthy. And I would urge you all to look at Dr. Richard Jackson's work with the CDC and with the public health departments on the relationship between planning and public health. So we know we're eating the wrong thing, okay? Most of our food is highly processed. The average American dies with about 40 pounds of preservatives in his body. We don't seem to know how to eat well. Now, one of the issues is that 50% of the food grown in the U.S. it's a higher number, 60% is thrown away on on an annual basis. We have enough food in the world is grown to feed the entire population. It's just not getting there. We're spending the money and we're spending the time sending it within this country because we're not eating locally. Okay, so we've got to stop thinking about what Kunstler calls the 3,000 miles Caesar salad. You don't have to have everything all year round. That energy that brings the food to you year round could actually be sending that same food to places that need it more. And we'd be solving the Earth's problem in terms of consumption of food. And then finally, the housing demand. We're building the wrong kind of housing. Developers still think that we're building for the nucleus family, mother, father, and 2 children. Okay, that's the predominant amount of housing that's built is for that demographic. When that demographic in the US is only 27%. 37% of the US is single households. Okay, and we are not building housing for that demographic. We still are building the minimum 2-3 bedroom units. What we really need to be doing is building studios, 800 square foot units, and that's where the demand really is, or has been. Is we're only solving the housing that we're putting on the market is only solving a very small percentage. We're building too much of the wrong stuff. And then we get architects experimenting with housing, which has always been a ludicrous idea. Architects should really be kept out of the low-income housing process because people don't really want that stuff. Okay, they don't want to live in experiments. They want to live in normative housing. So paint a pretty dim picture here. There we are, sailing off the cliff, but That's the crises we feel. All these have come together in the last 10 years, in a kind of tsunami. So I always kind of say, who wants change? And everyone puts their hand up. And then you say, who's willing to change? And nobody really is willing to change. And I think that's really been an issue everywhere. And that's global. It's not just in the US. So from despair, there is hope. And that's why I think, a lot of us are doing what we're doing because we really believe that there is hope. And so, as I said, going back to Seaside 5 years or 6 years ago to really kind of look at what we had done there and what we had learned over the last 30 years was really sort of a kind of a formative process for me. So I'm going to just, talk about a few issues that I found. One is, we really need to change the focus. We need to be thinking about the pedestrian first rather than the car, and that is what I call the, the new urbanist eye chart. We have to be thinking about the smallest person who's going to use the public realm. That's the most important person. That should be on top of our list, okay? And trucks and cars, etc., are at the bottom. So we need to put on a new set of glasses. Jan Gehl, the Danish planner, says every city needs a department of pedestrians, or for pedestrianization, okay? We have a Department of Transportation, which only deals with that bottom half of automobiles, etc. We need a department that takes care of pedestrians and promotes pedestrian life. And that's the first thing any good city should be doing. So suppose when you change your focus, instead of having that beg button on the crosswalk where the pedestrian has to press the button to hope that the light will change so he or she can cross the street, what if the car had to do that and the pedestrian had the right of way at the intersection? And I think that's what we really need. We need to have a complete turnaround in our thinking about how we deal with the issue of pedestrians. We have to reform single-use zoning practices. That is still, there's only compared to what's going on, there's just a handful, a minute amount of new urbanist projects in the country. And we've been doing this for the last, 35 years. And we're still, most of the country is single-use zoning. Most of the things that we propose are illegal, cannot happen. I remember all the fights that we had just trying to get the auxiliary units in Kentlands, and not having them count against the density or the number of kitchens that they were counting. That was a big battle to get auxiliary units in. But you can look at this breakfast in many ways. You can look at the yellow as housing. You can look at those sausages as retail. You can look at the potatoes as commercial. And that's what we do with our cities, right? We spread it. We segregate everything in these neat compartments. And there was a time when that was essential, when we had noxious uses in cities. Today, most of that's gone. You can be living next to a bakery, and it's absolutely fine. In fact, it would be wonderful to live with a bakery downstairs. So we don't really need, we really need to reform zoning principles. And what we need to go back to is this, the healthy breakfast, where everything is mixed up. You really have mixed use. It's all jumbled up together, and it's basically form-based and not density and use-based. The neighborhood. As I said, cities are made up of neighborhoods, and these are little entities that are pretty much autonomous. A neighborhood allows you to be in that area within a 10-minute walk, access to all your daily needs. The idea of the neighborhood really kind of came up earlier on in 1927. Clarence Perry did that diagram on the left, and New Urbanists in the 80s, we did this diagram where we kind of separated the traditional neighborhood from the sprawl neighborhood. And this continues. We still keep looking at the neighborhood. This one is by Doug Farr with a kind of environmental overlay put on the neighborhood structure. In the taxonomy of cities, we have basically three categories. We have the neighborhood, which is the mixed-use areas, but then we have, not every area can be completely mixed use. We also have districts, which are single use, like an academic campus is generally, you have a business district sometimes, hopefully avoidable, but that's a district of single use, or an airport, or a public works area. And then you have in that taxonomy, you have corridors, and you have different types of natural corridors, parkways, boulevards, rail, highways, etc. And that pretty much identifies the kind of taxonomy of pieces that we work with in the built environment. On the other side, you know, great places are made up, have a product. So you got to make a neighborhood really work, you gotta have some level of employment. Because the only way transit works is if you have employment and the bus comes full in the morning and leaves full. Okay, and that's how transit works best. So the idea of excluding employment in a neighborhood is you know, a misnomer in terms of affordable transit. This drawing could have multiple readings, but I'm really talking about thriving communities having transit. And around that transit stop, one is all access to all your daily needs. So you make that one trip in the morning, you pick up your newspaper or whatever, drop off your laundry. When you come home, you pick up your laundry on your way home, but you have access to the movie theater, to the bank, to shopping, to another bus system, food, etc. This is from Enrico, one of the mayors of Curitiba, who said an advanced city is not a place where the poor move around in cars, but rather where even the rich use public transportation. And when you think of places like London or Japan, cities in Japan, this is absolutely true, or even New York. The fifth lesson is about public participation, okay? And no, today, you know, for good and for bad, we have to include the public in everything that we do, okay? Because there's always someone ready to object, even before they know what you're going to do. And that's just the reality. We've done, as professionals, we've done such a terrible job that people prefer the fallow piece of land than having a developer or an architect or anyone build on it, because they don't trust that what's going to be built will be better than that empty piece of land. And then you have, you know, the cave, the citizens against virtually everything, and the bananas who want you not to build anything at all anywhere. Then this notion that small is beautiful. Leon Krier, we spent 10 years together working on his book, and traveling with him was really one of the most insightful parts of my education. One of the things he said was that when you go on vacation, when you choose a city to go to, you mostly 99% of the places that you go on vacation are places that are under 4 or 5 stories. Okay, think about it. Where do you go to vacation? Do you go, you know, to a place full of high-rise buildings, or do you go to a place that's relatively low scale? All the places that we love are small, have small increments of development. Okay, so big is not always better, and places are built incrementally, okay? And those are the places that are charming, as opposed to these strip shopping centers, or what he calls landscrapers, that are just kind of squeezed out and built all at one time. A city can survive a lot of small, ugly buildings, but it cannot survive large, ugly buildings, because that part of the city is forever destroyed. So, you know, when we look at what's happening on the north side of Kentlands and Lakelands, you really have to think twice about, you know, the big buildings at 12 stories or 10 stories, because they will absolutely destroy the character of place, no matter how good the architect is. And we have to look for these opportunities where there's vacant lots. Now, you know, when we were working in Lexington, Kentucky, that was a block that was decrepit. And the first thing that the city wanted to do was to find a developer to take over the entire block to redevelop it. Okay? And our proposal was not that, was to really look at all the opportunities and to have smaller works done. And then here was a parking lot. You have to look for all these little opportunities. This was a parking lot that was mostly vacant, which we converted into a linear park and an infill building on the right. And we were able to parcel off these small parcels of land to permit small builders to come in and work within the fabric, as opposed to wait or hope that the big developer is going to come and save the day. And stay away from, you know, this is now being sold as an ecological form. Norman Foster and John Novell, everybody is building buildings like this under the guise that it's economical. I mean, it's efficient and ecological, but it's disaster. This happens to be in Barcelona, but look at where it is. Okay, look at the scale of where it is, and there you have that. So you just have to remember that all things big, have to come down, okay? And we have to stop this hubris that we want to build these tall buildings. And finally, beauty, okay? We cannot forget about beauty, okay? It's kind of incumbent that there's beauty in landscape, which we should all work to preserve. There's beauty in these conditions, the kind of melding of architecture and landscape. There's beauty in a plan like this of Jaipur, a beautiful plan done in the 15th century. And there's beauty in infrastructure. Infrastructure belongs to everybody, okay? And it should not be devoid of beauty. In the end, the Golden Gate Bridge is nothing but a piece of infrastructure, okay, which defines that city. The image on the right is the public works in Philadelphia that Latrobe designed as the base of the art museum. And he did an appropriate, this is just basically pumps inside those buildings, but he realized that he needed a base, a little city or village along the waterfront as a landscape as you approach the city from crossing the river. Now, one of the other notions, and this is a Joe Riley, the mayor of Charleston's message, one of the reasons why we have to have beauty, or think about beauty in a city, is because some of us are privileged to travel to beautiful places like this. And these are places that really take your breath away and make life worth living. Okay, they uplift the human spirit. When you go and you see this kind of beautiful place at sunset, it's really, it does something to you. It does something to your body, to your brain, to everything about you, okay? But there are many people in every city that are unfortunate to be able to travel. And we owe it to everyone that we have to make things that are beautiful so everyone can enjoy it in their own city or their own neighborhood, okay? So every single decision has to be made with that in mind, that if you're going to do a fountain, you're going to do a piece of infrastructure, think about making it as beautiful as it possibly can, okay? Not the bottom line, which is unfortunately what happens most of the time. So I'm going to sort of end with Kentlands. So there was an article written some time back about the 25 things that the new urbanists, great ideas that the new urbanists had come up with over the last, since 1993. And I went through that list and I looked at what had happened in Kentlands and what we had done in Kentlands in 1988. And we hit kind of 12 of the points out of that 25 happens to be here. And I thought that was, pretty remarkable for a bunch of kids who really didn't know what we were doing at the time. And we were just kind of grappling. The only real other major project had been Seaside. Everything else had been relatively small prior to Kentlands. So I looked at this and I thought, okay, what's missing? Okay, and I looked at my Google Maps to come here, and it was going to take me about an hour, 45 minutes if I took transit to get here, okay? And I thought, come on, that's, and I knew, and then I looked at Google Maps and it told me it was going to take 1 hour plus something, so I was going to save about 45 minutes if I drove, and that really should not be the case, okay? You got to put transit on par with traveling in an automobile, okay? And so I'm going to just show you this because it's just done this morning. What if the red line continued up the railroad tracks to Washington Grove, stopped, there's a station right there, turned over, came to Gaithersburg, through the center of Gaithersburg, went to the National Institute of Science and Technology, and then made its way down to Kentlands. We have to think beyond. I know we're all thinking about the BRT and the bus and all that, but those are all stopgap. There's no time like the present. There's no time like really doing something and demanding a bold step to really connect you to the city, to Washington. Just imagine all the money that's spent in that 4.5 or 5 miles that goes into extending the metro line, okay, will be recovered in no time, okay, by what will happen to this place and its access to the city. It will completely change. And, you know, we really need to start thinking about these places, because no place is going to survive in the future without transit. Efficient transit, okay, not boutique, you know, and it's just for the unfortunate, because no one, okay, it's going to be a horrible place for your children in 35 years, okay? By 2050, it's going to be a horrible world to live in, okay? We're going to be fighting over water, we're going to be fighting over oil, we're going to be fighting, it's not going to be pleasant, okay? And the one way places will survive is if they're efficiently sustainable, if they have transit that can get you around the place without having to use your car. And time will also be important. So I'm going to end with the idea of the neighborhood. You could look at this area as a series of neighborhoods, Kentlands, Washington Grove, Gaithersburg, or small towns connected. Look at this one kind of collective piece. And then neighborhoods, once you get it right, they're fragile, okay? And we've done a terrible job in many beautiful places by making bad decisions that have ruined some really wonderful neighborhoods, and many cities have suffered from this. You know, so these poor decisions, like running a road or a highway through a neighborhood, and the kind of notion of progress or making it easy for someone to get from A to B, we fractured many of the great places in this country. But we have to, you know, break a few eggs, change rules, fight for what we know is a better way of doing things. And in the end, if all this is done, you create value. Because in the end, urban design creates value. Good urban design, strong ideas create value. And that's the one thing. Once you take a plan and put it on a piece of ground, it has value. It has no value till that plan has been done. So I hope you all feel empowered to go out and create a better world and better environment and fight for all those decisions. Okay? Come to a fork, take it, and make sure you have my book under your arm. And certainly, you know, all this is a failure of your imagination, that you can't get things done. And there it is. And I'll end with this image of the original team. This is 15 years ago in 2003, was some of the original team got together. At that time, there was talk about a light rail line maybe coming into the northern part of Kentlands, but that soon disappeared, that idea, but that was on the table, and we worked on that. So thank you.
You have time for questions?
Sure, absolutely. Yes.
If you could wave your magic pencil and change one thing about Kentlands, what would it be? One thing that we currently have.
The retail that's happening on the north side. I think that's, I mean, some of the stuff on this side is really quite nice. It's charming. It might not, you know, I think it's hard to support some of that without density. But you know, you can get very high density in 4 or 5 stories, and there's an opportunity to really do something that enhances Kentlands on the north side. Okay, and I don't think 10 stories is the answer. Yes?
Do you think that there's a relationship between the type of architecture and the success of an urban environment?
I think there's definitely a relationship between the disposition of the architecture. Style is irrelevant, I think, when it comes to good urbanism. Buildings actually contributing to the urban realm. It can be any style you want, as long as buildings contribute to making space, defining the street, defining the public realm, okay, and you know, and being appropriate. So it's really not the style that I think makes a difference. I mean, there are many, many cities around the globe that have a variety of different styles, and they're still beautiful cities that work. So, yes?
Do you have any thoughts about aging, aging in place, aging in America, aging globally? How this might affect the planning of urban areas?
Well, yes. We actually, there's a large group within the CNU that's been working on Aging with Grace as a platform or initiative. And, you know, neighborhoods that have a variety of different housing types work best. So, you know, you might move out of your large home into a smaller unit, okay, if the smaller unit exists. So I think this diversity in housing type is extremely important in various neighborhoods because it permits you to move within the neighborhood. And currently, I think in most of the country, you can't do that. In suburbia, you can clearly not do that because it's one type, and that's the only type. But also, I think there's, you know, the simple row house has been modified. Let's say that type of housing has been modified over and over again to be multi-family, you know, from a single family to multi-family. It's happening all over the place. So it is possible to take that type, if you happen to be in a row house, or even in a house, and convert it into multiple units, if the code permits it. Now, you know, most codes don't permit you to change the density of the existing structure. So that's the other idea of a form-based code over a Euclidean zoning.
And do you think that technology will replace community?
No.
In the sense of suburban sprawl, where you have nothing. I mean, you can age in your house, but you can't age in your community because there isn't.
You know, technology, one of the things that we've been studying is, and in fact, in October there's a symposium at Seaside on Aging with Grace, specifically dealing with this, and Richard Jackson and the AARP and folks are going to be at that symposium. And we're kind of really looking at, one of the aspects of it is really looking at technology, telemedicine, and how that can help at least short-term take care of folks, and what does it take to implement that. You know, and that's where I think technology is terrific in terms of the smart city notion for, you know, monitoring the health of elderly folks so they can actually stay if they're not close to a hospital or a region like Seaside, which doesn't have a hospital right there. You know, and there are groups who are modifying, there's this kind of a new subset business where they're modifying homes for the elderly so that they can continue to stay in their homes and then rent out a section, you know. And this is actually very popular in Sweden right now, where they're actually converting, if you're over a certain age, you can take your large home and convert it into multiple units, where a caregiver might live in one of them, but you rent the rest of the house. So I think those are policies that are very progressive and should be implemented. Yeah. Yes. Go back there, yes.
What's the most rewarding project you've worked on in your career?
The what?
The Kentlands.
The most what?
Rewarding.
Rewarding. Well, rewarding. It's probably the work that we've done in India, in some of the townships in India, where we took on, in India, architects get paid 2.5% cost of construction, which is an impossible fee to do anything. So when you get into affordable housing or low-income housing, you get the dregs of the profession taking on those projects, you know, so you get horrible, horrible housing, unthought of. And when we were doing a township, a new township, which was mixed income, mixed use, we negotiated to do the lowest, the low income housing. And That has been extremely successful. The one thing I did negotiate on that, well, we negotiated a 3.5% fee, which was, the developer thought it was, ridiculous that he was going to pay any architect 3.5%. But what we did do was we said that for every building they repeated that we had done, because they were going to repeat the buildings in different parts, we would get the same 3.5%. And so economically, it was a great decision because I still get checks from those buildings because they were the most efficient. They were 450 square foot units, and they're the most loved units by the poorest segment. So think about this. Somebody who's buying a 450 square foot unit, right, a subsidized unit, still has somebody coming in to cook their food for them. Okay, in the Indian city, because there's always someone lower than you. And we didn't understand that. So the way this unit is actually designed is it permits you to lock the rest of the house and have access, give someone else the access to the kitchen. And that has, just understanding that little dynamic, which I would have never imagined when I first started working in India, has made these units extremely popular. And also there was energy package with the unit that has also made it very efficient long term. So I'm more satisfied with that, the discoveries that we did there, and it wasn't like we got it right the first time or anything. It took a very long time to get it right, but it's proven to be a very rewarding project. So, yes, anyone? Yeah. So.
So you showed a map that, since we're all Kentland Lakeland people in the room most likely, the map of the red line extending
Yes.
around here probably made everybody very happy. But what about all the rest of the suburbs around? How do we connect everything?
Well,
I'm sure if we wanted to lobby to connect the red line to Kentlands, the people in Clarksburg and Germantown might have a few things to say about it.
Well, you need a network. You definitely have to go for a network. This is, again, 6 o'clock this morning. I said I got to, look at this a little closer.
Please make posters of this for all of us.
T-shirts.
Well, we have to look at places which are compact, dense, okay, and what makes sense, okay. You don't want to have a train station on a corner where no one can walk to, okay. So it's strategic. When I looked at this, I was looking at where would this make the most amount of sense, okay, for a community, okay. I might have gotten it wrong, but at least my cursory look was at that. Now there might be other areas in here where you could have stops or extensions, where there is walkable communities that people could walk to the stations. But that was really the criteria, was where does it make, because there's going to be a lot of suburbs that cannot. There's a group in CNU that's working on retrofitting suburbia, okay, a very strong group. But there's some areas that cannot be saved. I just got to say it. There's just some areas that cannot be saved. Okay, the investment would be far too great for the return. So we got to look at places where putting money into transit, et cetera, really improves, the sustainability of those areas. Okay, and it's going to be a very hard decision, but transit has to work both ways. So what this means is, you're going to need more employment for this to be viable, okay? So that the transit actually, when it comes in, is actually bringing people in, and the train. Transit doesn't work if it's one way, and that's the problem with all these satellite cities. Okay, the satellite cities don't work. The transit never pays for itself, is because. And that is also the problem with the metro system in Washington. When the metro system was designed for Washington, it was only designed to bring people in. It was a very myopic system, the spider web coming in. It wasn't, they didn't think that the trains would have to go out. And that's why it's been struggling financially. Every metro station has to have, a fair amount, a robust amount of employment. So And that's where, things like, when the FBI was going to go out to Greenbelt, station around Greenbelt, that would have, really changed that area. Unfortunately, they also wanted 3,000 parking spaces for the SUVs, so it didn't make any sense at all. But they actually, because GSA when Robert Peck was at GSA, he said all new buildings would have to be near transit. So the FBI looked at transit stops, but then they weren't ready to give up their cars. They didn't think anyone was going to use their cars to get to work. So, but I don't know if Clarksburg and these other communities have the population, and there is a place where, you could capture within a 10-minute walk a large population, then that would be worth considering.
Any other questions?
Yes.
How is urbanism changing to become more sustainable? It's one of the things I do think about with Kentlands, and I've lived here for a long time. It's a wonderful community, and the planning was, record-breaking in many ways, but the materials were so conventional in terms of environmental load, not being very practical. How is urbanism changing to address those issues?
Well, the most efficient building is one that touches another building. Okay, and that's has least exposure. So as long as we are stuck with the idea of a single-family house, you've got the maximum surface to heat that's going to lose or gain heat. So I think a lot of our work in cities, in repairing cities, is promoting buildings that touch each other. Okay, minimizing the exposure. So that's one aspect that's always worked in cities, and they're more efficient. The new standards, we really don't get into we're fighting really the kind of we're trying to get the urbanism right, okay, and we're still giving LEED a platinum certification to buildings, out of nowhere. I mean, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is in the middle of nowhere, and it claims to be a platinum building. Half their kind of eco employees have left because they can't get to work. So it's only the ones who have cars can get there. So we're still trying to, have people rethink where they build new buildings, okay? The one thing is that every single employer is in the transportation business. And they have to realize that, okay? If you are an employer, you're in the transportation business, okay? And that's it. And you have a responsibility, okay, to deal with the transportation. And you cannot expect the city or anybody to give you a subsidy to build parking lots or highways, et cetera, or interchanges. Those days are over. Those days should be over, okay? It's just a fallacy to think that, because we're going to put employment here, the city owes us all this infrastructure costs. No, you got to pay for that. And I think this is what cities, these giveaways that cities are doing, and Roberta Brands, forget what her last name is, did a really great story, book on ballparks, and how most of the ballparks and football stadiums returned nothing to their cities, returned absolutely nothing. And and we're still in this mode that we got 8 games a year on a football stadium. I mean, it's mind-boggling that people still think that that's the way to go, So those are the bigger issues, I think, for urbanism. And yes, we need better materials. And unfortunately, that's a real. I mean, we need better architects, but the materials are really problematic. And unfortunately, that is really driven by developers. I mean, Brian's sitting here, and he knows. I'm sure he's had many fights with developers about materials. But
Just today.
Hmm?
Just today.
Just today, yeah. It's constantly, it's a constant battle because people just want to do those buildings and flip them. They're not thinking long term. And I think that's what we should be legislating, not, giving away money to rich owners of ballparks, etc. But I mean, I think in many ways we really need to look at Europe and places like that invested in transit after World War II. And that's why I say there's no time like now, because you can see in 50 years what a difference it made to those cities. Okay, it really made a tremendous, not that they don't have cars, but it's pleasurable to drive your car on the weekend. You don't have to use it every single day. Well,
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Dhiru.
sure. Okay, thank you.